Hello lovely sourdough fans. Today I'm going to show you the second video of my sourdough starter series where I'm going to talk a little bit more about sourdough starter, and this time we're going to actually think about how you get your starter ready for baking bread, how you know when it's ready for baking bread, and what you do afterwards with that. So how do you actually maintain a sourdough starter? And those are the topics I'm going to cover today. I'm going to start with my brand new starter, which I've actually started with you guys on the last YouTube video, and I've just mixed in some flour and water, have been feeding this every single day. I used 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water every day, and I always discarded half of my starter before I gave it another feed. Now it's developed into a really active, lively bunch of sourdough cultures, which is really awesome. This is after about an entire week, which is pretty much where I want it to be. You can see it's got plenty of activity, it's got plenty of bubbles, it smells perfect. It's not too sour, not too sweet, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. I will now, in this case, basically now it'll be ready for me to use and make a bread. Now, how do you actually know when your starter is ready for baking a bread? That's a question that many of us always ask ourselves, and I think that's one of the big points where people struggle when they're baking sourdough bread. So let me take you through the entire process of how you get this thing ready. First of all, every person's sourdough starter is completely individual. So your starter might be completely different to mine and might have a completely different schedule to mine. That depends on factors such as the temperature in your house, the environment, what's going on with your flour, how old is it, but that's something we talked about last time. This time I'm gonna just assume that you are still using the same flour, you're happy with the flour you're using, you've understood sort of how fast it works and how well it ferments, and we're gonna basically take it from there. Now, what I've done this morning, and this is what you do when you are starting to think about baking a bread, is you first of all think about a schedule. You need to have an actual schedule in mind. What do I want to achieve with my bread? When do I want to be ready to bake it? And how long will that process take me? So my schedule, for example, is I feed my sourdough starter in the morning. So I discard everything but 50 grams of my sourdough starter, which is about 2 tablespoons worth. I then feed it with 100 grams of water and 100 grams of flour. The water always has around 26 to 30 degrees temperature. That depends on how warm it is in your house, okay? So if it's nice and warm, around 22 degrees in your house, I'd go up to 30 degrees with your water temperature. You'll then feed it, and you can now either leave it at room temperature to then develop and ferment, or you put it straight into a proving cupboard, which means that you have a controlled environment. I prefer that second option because I like to have a controlled environment and know exactly when my starter will be ready. So I just use one of those home proving cupboards that you can essentially buy and pop it in there. Those are the same ones that you use for yogurt making as well. Pop it around 27, 28 degrees, and essentially I then know in about 4 hours time my starter will be ready. Now, how do you know when it's actually ready? Okay, so I placed a rubber band around mine. I'll show you one of my slightly older starters. I've basically fed it this morning, and I would say it's been about 4 hours now. I have placed a rubber band exactly where my starter was when I fed it, and now I can say it's a bit more than doubled in size in this time, okay? I want it within 4 hours to double in size for me to know that my starter is vigorous, that my starter can consistently perform really well to actually raise my bread, and I know that this will continue rising because currently it's got a bit of almost like a little dome on it, which means it's still going up. You want to use your starter anywhere between this time now and the time where it looks a bit like this, which is when it's very mature. At this point, it's been nearly 8 hours, okay? And it's actually starting, and you can almost see this, to dip. This is what you call peak point. Okay, that means your sourdough starter has now reached its highest level of peak. What happens after this point is that your starter will slowly start dipping. And again, you will see this. If you were to leave the starter for another couple of hours, I would start seeing some leftover dough, and I would know my starter is now too past its peak point. It wouldn't be able to lift the bread up anymore. That is when I know I'm gonna have to discard most of it again, apart from 2 tablespoons, and give it another feed, and it'll be ready again between 4 and 8 hours, something like that for a white starter. Okay, so let's assume we're going at 4 hours and we're very happy with the starter. I've kept mine at a controlled environment at around 27 degrees so that it basically gets a 26-degree starter going, which is a really perfect temperature for lots and lots of milk bacteria. They really like it at this temperature and create a really lovely sweet aroma. If I use a young starter, I essentially get bigger bubbles, which in baking terms we call an open crumb. If I use an older starter, I will get more acidity. Therefore, my crumb will close up slightly, my holes will be slightly smaller inside the bread, but I'll get probably a little bit more flavor. So that's sort of the 2 things you need to bear in mind when you want to decide how to schedule the start of you making a bread. I tend to go with the young one. I really like how that tastes, and I would now take my starter, and you can perform one big test. Let's show you that test. This is the so-called water test, and essentially I've got just a little bit of tap water, and I'm going to drop in some of my starter to check how active my starter is. And this is about the right texture, by the way. So you want something that comes in lumps rather than as a massive stream. And you want to drop a little bit of that into your water. It's a little bit tricky to get that in there, but you can try. Very carefully, not too fast. You don't want to let it fall in. You want to carefully place it in. And I'll tell you exactly why you do that carefully. It's because you want to see whether this starter at this point is young enough and bubbly enough to lift up your bread. And you can see it's staying right at the top. That means there's a lot of activity in there. This, and some expert bakers say, this is not a sign of your starter being vigorous, i.e. it consistently performing well and consistently performing the same way. But it is a sign that your starter is active, and that's exactly what you want at this point. If you take a slightly more mature starter, which is this one, you can see still it has a beautiful texture. It will still probably stay at the top because it's still just at its peak, and it will still be able to perform exactly in the same way. But as you can see, it's actually falling a little bit further down straight away. This tells you that the fermentation has started to dip, okay? So we're now possibly at that peak point, and possibly past that peak point very soon. That means it probably won't have enough bubbles and not enough activity to actually lift up your bread in the long run. So you will end up with smaller bubbles and a slightly more closed crumb, as we call it. Okay, so that's a great test to see whether your starter is at the right level for you. If it drops down straight away, it's either not fermented enough, so it's not ready yet, or it's completely past its peak. And you will see that in combination with a drop in your starter. So those are the factors you need to look out for when you are judging whether your starter is ready for you to use. Now, what happens when you actually use your starter? Let's talk a little bit about how much starter should you be using in a normal standard loaf. I tend to go anywhere between 10 and 20%. Now, if I go for something like 10% and use a very young starter, one that I really like using, one that is about 4 hours old, I get something that's really light and really well developed. When I use a starter that has about 10-15%, and when I say 10-15%, I always mean as a percentage of the entire amount of flour I'm using for the recipe. So if, for example, I use 1 kg of flour in my bread recipe, I go between 100 and 150 grams of young starter. That's because I like to make a bread that I prove overnight in the fridge. It needs a starter that's still very young and active, that isn't too much of a starter, it's not too much of it in my bread, and can raise it even when it's in the fridge and almost goes into hibernation state. When you use a slightly more mature starter, you want to stay anywhere between 10 to 15% as well, but you may want to actually bake it the same day. Use about 20% and your bread will rise very, very much, very quickly, but you will have to combine it with a much stronger flour, such as a Canadian flour, for example, because that one develops very slowly over time and allows you to raise your bread over longer periods of time, okay? So I would stick with about 15% if you're a beginner and just starting out to make your first breads. That always gives you a really, really good indication of a good loaf that's well developed with a young starter. Now let's quickly have a quick look at this. This was my young starter. And as I've said to you, this will probably most likely still stay at the top because it's young, it's still developing. Whereas my slightly more mature starter, which has just started dipping, is now here on the ground. That tells you exactly what will happen with your bread. This guy here will have plenty of lovely bubbles that it can distribute in the loaf and can really create a lovely oven spring. Whereas that guy here will create amazing flavor, but it will not be able to help you achieve those lovely big bubbles and that open crumb in the same way as this guy. So that's just the difference between the mature and the young starter, and the activity and the bubbles in it. Now you know how much starter you use to actually make your bread. So we're going between 10 and 20%. You experiment at home however you feel and notice the differences. Try and keep every other variable the same when you're making bread. Always only change one variable at a time and notice the difference that your bread will basically look, feel, smell, taste, and then you can make changes based on that. Starter is one thing that I try and keep consistently the same, because if I keep my starter at the same temperature, prove it in a consistent environment, I will consistently get a vigorous, active starter that will perform in the way I need it to. Last thing, maintenance. So what happens after you've actually used your starter and you want to pop it wherever you want to pop it? What do you do with it now? I tend to bake almost every day. So I bake every 2-3 days. If you bake every day or every other day like me, perhaps even every 3 days, I keep my starter at room temperature. You want to keep it near you and you want to always be in control of how active it is. Then you basically take off everything but 2 tablespoons of your starter, and you feed it with 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water once or twice a day, depending on how fast your starter goes. You know the indications, you know what to look out for. The rubber band will help you understand where it is, and it will also show you when it's starting to dip. So just base it on that, okay? Once it's dipped, that's when you want to feed it. If you are a baker who bakes about once a week, what you do after you've used your starter to make a bread is you again discard most but 2 tablespoons, and then you give it a feed in the same way as you would if you were to keep it at room temperature. 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. Leave it for about half an hour just to gain a little bit of traction, and then place it in the fridge. 24 hours before you want to bake, you take it out of the fridge, discard all but 2 tablespoons, and give it a feed about twice before you start baking, so that you know your starter is at the right level again. Remember the factors to look out for. If you only bake once a month or even less than that, you just keep your starter in the fridge or even freeze some of your starter. You can freeze your starter easily by just adding more flour until you have a ball that's quite thick, okay? So you basically use a lot less water, or you use the same amount of water but a lot more flour, and keep it in a nice ball, possibly wrapped in some cling film or some foil in the freezer. Defrost it when you're ready, and then start the feeding and discarding routine for a good week before you start again. If you keep it in the fridge, essentially for every week that I keep my starter in the fridge without feeding, I give it 1 feed before I start baking a bread. So for example, if I've kept my starter in the fridge for 4 weeks and I was away on a lovely holiday, I come back and I feed it 4 times before I start baking my next bread. That's just as a rule of thumb, but again, you will start learning to judge how that will behave and how that will feel to you. You will start learning to see how much more vigorous the starter will be after a while, and will learn its peak performances again. So that's the stuff to look out for. That's your starter maintenance. That's how you get ready with a starter for baking. And next time I will cover what happens when you introduce wholemeal flour to your starter and whole grains to your starter, and some great troubleshooting tips. So if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to leave me, just comment below and I'll happily cover that the next one in the next sourdough starter video. See you guys next time.